Hello and welcome everyone to my premiere episode of my brand new A-Level Psychology revision channel, Born Psyched. Hope you enjoy. Welcome to the first topic in the attachment specification. Today we are going to be looking at caregiver interactions. This focuses on the early interactions a parent has with their child, and this is really important because this helps children to learn socialization, or at least the very first stages of this. There are two main topics within caregiver interactions. We're going to be looking at reciprocity and interactional synchrony. Okay, let's have a look. The first topic we're going to look at is reciprocity. Now, reciprocity comes from this idea from the late 70s that was suggested that infants and children have what we call a conversation with each other. That not in the conversation that you'd think of between two adults, but more a kind of give and take of different actions and reactions. So from birth, it suggests that this rhythm develops. So an infant does something, an adult responds, and often vice versa. So it does appear as though some sort of conversation is going to take place. Classic example would be a child pointing to something and having an adult turn to look at what the child is pointing. You have action and you have reaction. Now, we call this reciprocity because when one thing happens, then another happens in response. The best example we have of this is something called the still face experiment. If you look at this first image, you'll see that the child is obviously performing some sort of action. The mother is smiling in response. The child is then showing a much more positive action in response to that. So you can see this interaction taking place. Incidentally, you can find the video of this experiment on YouTube if you just type in the still face experiment. If you look at the second image, this is where you see the adult. This is the experimental condition where they are completely still-faced in front of the infant, thus the reason for the name of the experiment. Now, if you see how the adult is looking, and then compare that to how the child is. Now, the child will try and get the adult's attention, but the adult has been instructed not to react in any way, shape, or form. And as a result, the child becomes very distressed because there is no reciprocity taking place. Any actions that the child has are not reciprocated by the adult. So the idea of this is it builds up this social interaction. So as you can see, research says this is really important for developing the rules, so to speak. Not written rules, but these unspoken rules that we all live by when we are conversing with another adult. Obviously, it'd be very, very difficult to talk to someone if all they did was pose a completely neutral face at you all the time. Okay. And next we have interactional synchrony. Now, this is similar to reciprocity in that it often requires some sort of action and then a reaction. But whereas with reciprocity, it's an appropriate response, with interactional synchrony, what you often get is a mirroring of the movements. So you do something, the other person will respond in the same way. Really great example of this is from a film I watched recently, the film Jaws. Now, about half an hour into this, you see the main character, Chief Brody. He's obviously really miserable about the shark attacking people, and he sat down at his kitchen table. He's making all these sign noses, clasping his hands, and his little son is watching him. And every movement he's making, his son is actually mirroring the same movement. Now, this is a really, really good way of demonstrating interactional synchrony. I'll leave the link to the YouTube video in the description below. Now, one of the best examples of research into interactional synchrony is that of Meltzoff and Moore, 1977. So what they did is they had an adult, I think it was Meltzoff himself, displaying a number of facial expressions and hand movements to a young infant. Now the infant had a dummy in their mouth during this, so that they weren't able to do anything. After the adult displayed this, they took the dummy out and they wanted to see what sort of movements the child made. Now, as you can see from this image, these are just some of the examples of facial expressions the adult made. What happened next is when they observed the infant's behaviour, they showed that the infant imitated a lot of the facial expressions and hand movements demonstrated by the adult, as you can now see in the second picture. Now, I'm not too sure how much I agree with that last point, but it suggests that children as young as 3 days old can actually do this. I'm not too sure about that one because I don't think children's visual acuity is as well developed at that point, but I could be wrong. So, there is a question about this imitation, about whether it's actually real or whether it's just a reflex action. Now, Meltzoff and Moore suggest it is intentional. The child is deliberately copying the adult. There is disagreement though, and some of the key disagreement actually comes from Jean Piaget. There he is in his rather fetching looking beret, sexy as ever. Now, Jean Piaget is a world-renowned psychologist, famous for a lot of developmental psychology, and if you study English language, you will often look at some of his work in terms of child language acquisition, and it does work really well with this particular topic. Now, he believed that imitation doesn't really occur until much later in a child's development, so that which you see very early on is, well, as he might put it, pure coincidence. Or, as he did argue, operant conditioning. So a child does something, if the child reacts in an appropriate way, then the child is rewarded in some way. Now, it might be by giving them attention, affection, etc. like that. And anything the child will gain pleasure for, i.e. positive conditioning, they're more likely to do in the future. So, he defined it as what we call pseudo-imitation. The idea is that the child looks like they're imitating it, but they're really not. Saying that though, there is other research to support Meltzoff and Moore's findings. Okay, so let's look at some evaluation points of caregiver interactions. So, first of all, there's this issue about testing infant behaviour. So, anyone who's ever watched kids, not in a creepy way, will know that children rarely stay still. Now, what this means is that it's very, very difficult to distinguish between what is a genuine response to others or what is just a random movement that a child will have under normal circumstances, what's defined there as general activity. So what that suggests is that it's actually really difficult to establish internal validity. You can't be sure you're actually testing imitation. Remember guys, when you're evaluating, make sure you always link the point back to the question. Okay. So, reliability. This follows on really well because often when you've got something that's low in internal validity, reliability will often establish in the same way. Forgive my pronunciation, but I believe it's Queka. Now, they were unable to replicate Meltzoff and Moore's findings. They tried it with a similar study and could not get the same sort of responses. Of course, then Meltzoff and Moore fought back and said, well, yours wasn't very well controlled, thus you weren't as reliable. Talk about, handbags at dawn there, but they may have had a point. And lastly, this is an interesting one, because what he's suggesting is babies will only copy actual human faces. They don't copy any other object designed to create the same things. Silly example, but things like puppets, etc. So they find it really easy to distinguish between what is a genuine human face and others that would imitate it. Now, obviously, this is really important for forming attachments. It means that, unlike in a study we're going to look at in a few videos' time, that they are able to distinguish between a genuine parent or human and another item that may produce similar responses. Okay, guys. Right, so let's move on to looking at some exam questions. I thought, as this was the first ever episode, we would look at the major problem that seems to catch all students out when it comes to A-level psychology, and that is essays. Now, whether you're doing AS psychology or whether you are doing the full linear A-level, the technique is just the same. All you have to do is make sure, if it is the A-level specification, that you are just writing more detailed evaluation. That is the only difference. For the purpose of this video, though, I'm going to make reference to the 12-mark AS questions, but you can just extend it with more evaluation points. Okay, so let's have a look at the grade descriptors, or the mark descriptors, should I say. What we see here is the top mark band from a mark scheme for an essay question. I'm not going to look at the other mark bands below it because, if we're all honest, these are the marks that we should be aiming for. So I'll just go through it. So knowledge is accurate and generally well detailed. Discussion, evaluation, application is thorough and effective. The answer is clear, coherent and focused. Specialist terminology is used effectively. Minor detail and/or expansion of argument sometimes lacking. But what does this actually mean? If we take that first part, this is where you can demonstrate that you actually know the theories that the question is asking you about. This is, in some way, your chance to show off. Now, out of the 12 marks, this is only worth 6 marks, so you've got to make sure that you keep it in balance. You don't want too much of this at the expense of your evaluation. With the AS question, it should be roughly 50-50. But it needs to be accurate and well detailed. So this is where, for example, if you were to talk about a theory of attachment, for example, you spend half the essay talking about that theory and giving relevant examples. Now, those examples can be specific to real life. Hell, it may even be something you've seen on the news or on a TV show, or it could be from actual research. But it is important you do use examples to demonstrate. The next part is where students tend to lose the most marks. And it's this thing about evaluation needs to be thorough and, the most important point, effective. Now, having attended loads of examiner moderation meetings, I can tell you that what examiners are looking for is students need to elaborate on the points. They need to link it back. And that if they don't do that, if they don't make their points effective, they will never get into this level 4 mark band. Now, if you are aware of this or not, the best example for any evaluation is the acronym PEEL. So it stands for point, evidence, elaboration, and linking back. The E's can be examples, elaboration. It doesn't necessarily matter. What does matter is that last point. Make sure that whatever you do, you link back your evaluation to the question itself. Now, the classic terminology for this would be something like, this suggests that, this implies that. This means that. That's really important. You have that concluding sentence after every evaluation point. Right, moving on. Specialist terminology. Now, there is some scope here for subjective judgment. What I would say, though, is that whenever you're describing or evaluating something, make sure you actually use that specific terminology that your teachers have made you learn throughout your course. So it is important to make sure that you say, okay, this is this uses that. And also, this is really important if you're talking about research methods. If you're going to mention ethical issues, actually give the name of the issue you're talking about. If you're talking about validity, say what type of validity it is, whether it's internal or external, ecological, etc. But make sure you use that terminology. And lastly, this is where the examiners are a little bit forgiving. Minor detail and/or expansion of argument is sometimes lacking. Now, examiners are fully aware that you students are under a lot of pressure in an exam, and that you're hardly likely to be performing absolutely perfectly. So this is them saying, we're going to accept very small mistakes because we understand that no one's perfect. But what they can't accept is if those mistakes are significant enough, they're going to detract from the overall quality of your essay. So little spelling mistakes here or there is absolutely fine. If you're out by odd percentages when you're giving figures, again, it does not matter. Just make sure that it's not significant, that it contradicts or takes something away from what you've already said. So hopefully if you follow these rules, when writing an essay, you should never go wrong. Okay guys, thank you very much for listening. I really do hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you have any comments, please write them below. If you want to subscribe, obviously click the link. The links to all the videos I've mentioned will be in the description below. Thanks for listening. Bye now.